Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and Distinguished Fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump squared off in the first and perhaps only presidential debate between the two nominees. And while people are debating how decisively Harris might have won, there seems to be widespread consensus that Trump lost. After a comparatively solid first 10 minutes on his two signature issues, the border and the economy, Trump then stumbled on abortion, was goaded into defending the size of his rallies, struggled to explain himself, and wasted considerable time relitigating the 2020 election. Harris, by contrast, stayed on message and gave a safe, defensive, if not particularly memorable performance. The question now is whether any of it matters. For all the talk of Harris's knockout blow on Tuesday night, CNN conducted a flash poll of debate watchers showing that they had moved slightly toward Trump on the economy, and a Reuters focus post-debate group showed 60% of undecided voters leaning toward Trump. So, Walter, was this debate news or faux news?
I think it was faux news, by the way, which made it a tremendous contrast with the first presidential debate of this year when Biden's performance basically led to his being knocked off the ticket by the Democratic Party. Though we should note that in the first debate, it was not a win for Trump. It was a loss for Biden. Trump did not, and Trump sort of stood by and watched the car crash happen. He didn't push Biden over the edge. Trump was almost a bystander at that debate. In this debate, as far as I can tell, we have to wait for more polling. I don't think it moved many minds. The people who care about things like debate performance have not been Trump supporters. People who want to make lists of how the candidates think on the issues and want to vote for sort of order and continuity and stability in government. They have never been Trump's support. People who want disruption, people who are angry at the establishment, people who, like a bad boy, don't care about rules. Those people tend to be more on the Trump side. But beyond that, let's not forget one really important thing. Almost everything we're seeing so far is that this race is going to be decided by about 250,000 mostly low information swing voters in a handful of key states. While the debate had decent ratings last night nationally, my guess would be that those 250,000 voters are among the least likely people in the whole country to have watched the debate.
All right, our second story. Iran has delivered a couple of hundred short-range ballistic missiles to Russia, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing conversations with U.S. and European officials. The exact number and make of the missiles was not disclosed in the report, but back in February, Iran had reportedly delivered around 400 surface-to-surface ballistic missiles to Russia. American and European officials at the time denied those reports, but threatened to impose coordinated sanctions through the G7 if the missile delivery went through. Now that it appears it has, European officials say they will move forward with sanctions crafted in partnership with the United States. The journal report noted, however, that while EU officials have called Iranian missile transfers to Russia a red line, quote, they have been more tentative in recent weeks. One senior European diplomat said last week that beyond the airline sector, other economic or banking ties with Iran will not be severed, close quote. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, in a sense, it's news because it's faux news. In other words, the Europeans are pretending to have a foreign policy once again. They don't have a policy, rather don't have an active policy. And neither really does the United States. What we're seeing is that the Biden administration is becoming sort of almost a weather vane. The wind blows, it points, but nobody follows, nobody obeys. Biden says, "Do not China help Russia's war effort." China helps Russia's war effort. Do not send missiles to Russia, Iran. Iran sends missiles to Russia. No doubt they'll come up with some sort of pathetic ineffective, not even quite fully symbolic set of measures that will enable European and American leaders to put the thinnest of fig leaves over the shame here. But fundamentally, Putin will see this, Xi will see this, Kim in Pyongyang will see this, and certainly the Ayatollah in Iran will see this as yet another sign that the Pax Americana is fading away, and that the Biden administration, in its sort of terminal months, does not at this point seem to have any idea of what to do. Almost reminds me a little bit of the James Buchanan presidency as states start to secede and arms start to disappear from Union forts across the South, and nothing happens. Nothing happens.
I saw another report in the journal about how the US and EU don't plan to take any measures in response to the recent IAEA report that Iran's expanding its stockpile of weapons grade uranium because apparently officials in Washington and Brussels are feeling cautiously optimistic about the election of Iran's new president and want to give him time to prove himself as a kind of change agent before using international institutions to punish Iran. Do you read that as a kind of tacit acknowledgement that there's not a lot we can actually do about Iran's nuclear program at this point? Or are we actually going down this road again of like, there's a new Iranian president and he might be a moderate?
Well, I think there's a third alternative. There are things we can do, but we're not going to do them. That's the message. At the moment, the message of the United States to Iran is we are not actually going to do anything to stop you from getting nuclear weapons. We will issue requisite de facto, sort of requisite pro forma statements, but everything about their posture, at least publicly, is sending the message that they're washing their hands of the whole matter. And again, you can certainly see that they don't want to do anything before the election, although paradoxically, I think it might help them in the election. They don't, and then after the election, even though Biden will still be in office, I think his people will have lost a lot of authority. But I think this has been in their heart of hearts. No president is going to say this, but I've come to believe that both President Obama and President Biden, in their heart of hearts, think that the worst things that could happen in the Middle East is for the U.S. to be in a war with Iran. The second worst thing is for Iran to get a nuclear weapon.
All right, final story of the week. Europe must increase public investment by nearly $900 billion a year in sectors like technology and defense, according to a long-awaited report published this week in response to growing anxieties about the continental economies lagging behind that of the United States and China. The challenge for the EU is, quote, existential, Mario Draghi said on Monday. If Europe cannot effectively compete and in turn provide its people with security and prosperity, he said, quote, it will have lost its reason for being. Draghi said that to meet the objectives in his report, the EU needed additional annual investment of up to 800 billion euros, an amount equivalent to about 4.5% of the union's GDP last year. By comparison, investment under the Marshall Plan from 1948 to 1951 was equivalent to about 1.5% of Europe's economic output. Walter, news or faux news?
Again, the news is that the news is faux. This is another report that I don't really see Europe doing much about. What is real news in this news is that the European elites are realizing the cost of their long-term addiction to bad economic policies. But honestly, by couching it as, okay, the EU needs to basically do this kind of joint debt spending where all the European countries will be jointly responsible for 4.5% of GDP EU spending. Draghi has pretty much ensured that his report will not actually be enacted. So the Germans aren't going to do it. And it's actually, and once it is really unnecessary, that is, if European countries were determined, said, you know what, I don't care about the rest of the EU, but in France, we're not going to decline. In Germany, we're not going to decline. In Denmark, we're not going to decline. What would they be doing? They would be deregulating. They would be setting up tech sectors. Israel is a very small country, and there are a lot of reasons that it's not ideally the place people would want to do business. But Israel wanted a tech sector, and it instituted a set of policies that, and lo and behold, it has a very dynamic tech sector. There's literally no reason why Lithuania couldn't do that, why Germany couldn't do that, why France couldn't do it, Italy couldn't do it, and they don't do it. I think the key reason they don't do it is because they're locked into both a mindset of caution, and there are so many things you'd have to change in the economy, regulations you would have to reduce, and so on, that they don't have the political will. What we see over and over and over again about Europe is that they love their policies, the social welfare state, the anti innovation agricultural policies, no GMO products and so on and so forth, green energy, all these things they just adore. There's only one little thing they don't like about their policies, and that's the results of their policies. Over and over and over again, we see that their dislike of the results of their policies is insufficiently strong to overcome their love of the policies themselves. So they complain, they write reports, but they don't change. As I understand it, in 1990, there were 12 countries in the EU at that time, and they accounted for something like 26% of global GDP. Today, there are like 27 countries in the EU, and they account for like 16% of global GDP. The US during all that time has remained at about 26% of GDP. Something is badly wrong in Europe. It is becoming more and more apparent. In a weird way, the Europeans are beginning to understand what happened to the countries they colonized in the 19th century. That is, in the 19th century, these European countries going through the Industrial Revolution and growing demographically went out there and basically just imposed their power on all these countries and peoples around the world who had no ability to resist them, no ability to reproduce the kinds of economic progress in their own countries that the Europeans had, and we just became more and more backward and inept. The Europeans are now experiencing that. China has completely eaten their lunch on a whole range of manufacturing products. India is headed there. Japan achieved more than parity with the EU at tech levels years ago. Countries like South Korea and Singapore are getting living standards that are higher than many European countries. None of it seems to change the European determination to continue genteel in the policy of genteel decline. Again, what I find a little bit alarming is that more and more you find this kind of thinking is getting stronger in the United States. And the conscious desire of people in the sort of democratic establishment to imitate Europe, to imitate exactly the features of European policy that are slowing their development, reducing their economic growth. We are seeing those things becoming little by little inserted into America's own economic development policies. It's not a good trend.
Just one follow-up. Could I ask you to elaborate on that final point? I mean, you hear a lot about how in both the Democratic and Republican Party in America, the kind of populist economic policies have become more widespread, whereas in Europe, you think of it as still being kind of technocratically administered. So what do you see as being the overlap between what's become popular in the kind of Washington establishment and what's popular in Europe?
Well, I think the Biden administration has discovered a glorious new way of doing things. Why not have technocratically administered populist stupidity? Why not borrow your ideas from the populists and then borrow your methods from the European technocrats? That way you can get an efficient destruction of the economy rather than the sort of slapdash destruction that populists normally bring.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. We're recording this, Walter, on September 11th, although the episode won't come out until a day or two later. But I wanted to ask you to kind of take a look back as we come up on a quarter century since 9/11 and how it is or isn't still shaping domestic and even electoral politics in America. I mean, it's very hard to imagine the entire Donald Trump era and phenomenon without the failures first of the George W. Bush administration and its responses to 9/11. And it's likewise hard to imagine the kind of victory that Barack Obama or the Obama wing of the Democratic Party has had over what was once the Clinton wing without the complicity, real and perceived, of Clinton and other leading Democrats in the war in Iraq and the larger failures of the global war on terror, which in turn continue to maybe color our debates about U.S. involvement in Ukraine, in the Middle East, our trust in elites, and so forth. So as a historian who also covers current events, are we still living in the world that 9/11 made, or are we in a different era of American and world history now?
Well, there's no doubt that 9/11 was a real turning point in American history. And I would say that today, what its effects are still felt strongest in sort of two different ways. One is that Americans are scared of the world beyond our border and see it as a place that bad things come from and that we need to be protected. And two is that they don't think American elites are particularly competent in protecting them or doing or accomplishing anything beyond our frontiers. In some ways, that shock was inherent in 9/11 itself. When people sort of, said, well, wait a minute, the CIA wasn't talking to the FBI. Why didn't that occur to somebody? And we were maybe a little bit lucky, or certainly politically, everybody was lucky in that 9/11 happened after George W. Bush had been president since January, but it also happened after the 8 years of Clinton's administration. Imagine if 9/11 had happened in the last year of Clinton's presidency, all of the fault and the responsibility would be seen to be on Clinton. Why didn't you take out Osama bin Laden? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And on the other hand, if it had taken place 2 or 3 years later, it would have been an entire, the whole thing would have been, why, Bush, haven't you done anything? Why have you mishandled everything so egregiously? So we never, and I think both sides didn't really want to go into the details that much. And I understand a former national security advisor walked out of an archive with some classified documents in his socks in an effort to prevent those from being better known. And the Bush administration was certainly not eager to let everybody know just what had or hadn't been said in the president's briefing and so on and so forth. So there was you can't not call something like 9/11 a massive failure. And it has shaken and it shook people, especially again, because after 2000, after 1990 was the end of history, everything was fine. Such things like this were not really going to be happening again. And here this is. Then we get into the response, and the response is sort of took several different forms. The sort of, in some ways, actually, the response has been very successful in that it's clear that the United States homeland has become safer since 9/11. Now, I don't know, with the border open the way it is and the Taliban back in control of Afghanistan, I'm not prepared to make any commitments about how safe we're going to be tomorrow or what might happen, what might be happening already that we don't see. But we did enjoy almost a quarter century of relative security at home after this attack. You cannot call that anything but a success. And many of the institutional problems that people had seen with the FBI, the CIA, things that the intelligence agencies weren't looking at, that they needed to look at, obviously they've looked at them. We also have to say that it's clear that whatever we've seen more recently in terms of the southern border when it comes to controls over suspicious individuals trying to enter the country through airports or other means like that, we've obviously had, we've had some success. And if you add to that the potential for growing radicalization over the internet, where there's no physical agent of a terrorist group actually acting in the United States, but nevertheless propagating the ideology. Again, you have to give some credit where credit is due. Some very dedicated, hardworking people whose names we don't know, who are doing these things out of the limelight and doing them because they need to be done, have had some success. On the other hand, that this strengthening of our intelligence network and our surveillance and all of this has clearly led to the FBI becoming a much bigger political player in the United States than it's been in the past. Whether we think of Hillary Clinton's emails and the various things that Director Comey did that sort of swung this 2016 presidential election in one way, then in another, and so on. Now, in Herbert Hoover's heyday, the FBI was about this politicized and about this powerful. But we are now seeing what was once a kind of the exceptional role of one very, very super powerful bureaucrat, the Robert Moses of policing. We are now seeing this on a more of a sort of routinized basis. The secret police, so to speak, are much more present in our lives, much more present in our conversation than before. And that is it's not necessarily a consequence of evil scheming by the deep state, but by the way that real dangers overseas create a greater need for and therefore more power for the deep state. It's sad, but I think necessary. I think we have to look at the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there, one thing I think it's really worth noting is that the costs of either starting the wrong war or carrying out a necessary war in a bad way are very large, very large. They are large, obviously, first and foremost for the people who live where the wars are fought. And the toll on Iraqis, on Afghans of these wars is immense. It will continue for many years. It will reverberate in their history and in their culture for generations. Does not necessarily mean, by the way, that the chance for good U.S. relations with these countries is destroyed forever. Look at Vietnam, which is, got quite good relations with the United States and arguably has more reason to hate us than Iraq or Afghanistan combined. Never. So people are this idea that somehow if you have a bad war somewhere, that's the end of your influence, the end of your relationship. It's amazing, quite amazing how pragmatic people are around the world. So you have that, then you have the financial cost in the United States, as well as the human cost, the casualties, the people whose lives are disrupted, the wounded. And because, by the way, these days we are much, much better at saving lives in combat, we have many more people survive with serious wounds that would have died in earlier wars. So the death tolls are lower, but the lives that are permanently altered by the war are growing. They have grown. And again, financially, given that the bulk of our spending, of our foolish spending, is on badly constructed domestic entitlements, I would say that that puts the $1 trillion war here and there in context. But it was certainly not helpful and not positive. The fact that for most of the time in Iraq, we had a terrible strategy, a series of terrible strategies that ended with the surge briefly, and in Afghanistan, we sort of never had an effective military strategy and developed one after another a whole host of idiotic civilian strategies, for turning Afghanistan into Paris, France, or something of that kind. Gender equality, rural development, all these fabulous things, but no military strategy. We definitely increased contempt for the United States at home and abroad, for American political leadership. People look at competence. In America today, if you go to Harvard and you don't major in the STEM things, you major in stuff, humanities type things, you're going to get an A unless and if you really screw up, you'll get a B plus, maybe a B, but that's serious. Well, our elite keeps giving itself A grades for bad performances or more commonly mediocre performances. And so all kinds of people who did dumb things and said dumb things, continue to kind of move along without really necessarily learning anything from what happened. And again, I supported the war in Iraq based on what I knew at the time. And then once we were in it, I said, we've got to stay in it because war is not a restaurant. You can't say to your waiter, this isn't the war I ordered. Take it back and bring me another one. And once you've done some things, you need to follow through. And we couldn't just sort of walk away and leave Iraq in chaos, I felt. But in any case, I've thought very long and hard. Why did I believe Colin Powell about weapons of mass destruction? Why did I let all the people I knew in the State Department and so on who assured me that they knew what they were doing and they had good plans for once we were in the war, who assured me that the guerrilla fighting that we were beginning to see was not a serious matter. What did I get wrong that I was so gullible for voices of the establishment? And this has changed. I've tried to learn from this. But you also have a problem. I think one of the costs of bad wars that people don't often recognize is it produces bad strategists. It generally produces a generation of terrible strategists. And this is something I learned watching the Vietnam War as a younger person, much younger person, that after the Vietnam War, there were during and after you had a whole generation of Americans for whom sort of the Vietnam War was the great mistake. It was the example of getting it wrong. And so the key to foreign policy was not to make the great mistake again. And so you had all these people, in very simplistic ways, kind of saying, okay, well, the problem was X, and therefore we must never do X again. And people like Joe Biden, I think, actually got a lot of his foreign policy instincts set by thinking, okay, how do we avoid the great mistakes of Vietnam? And you saw this again, I think, after the Iraq War that you have an entire generation of people, mostly in their 30s and 40s now, who sort of see history through the prism of the Iraq War. And obviously the United States should not have been in the Vietnam War. Obviously, the United States should have found another way to deal with Saddam than what we did. But you can't sort of generalize a kind of rule of history from one example. I think it remains the case that if you think about, the sort of 110 years since 1914, more people have died, including Americans, because America has stayed out of international politics where we could have done something constructive, then died because Americans got stuck our noses in where they didn't belong and bad things happened to us and to people. We spent more money fighting World War One than we would have spent preventing it. We certainly spent more money, lost more lives with World War Two. And had we not learned from those and resisted the Soviet Union, I think we would have ended up also in something that would have cost much more for the world than the Vietnam War and the Korean War combined. That is very grim and unhappy logic, but I think it's true logic. So what I think we're seeing is that a lot of people have kind of younger people generalizing from the experience of the Iraq and Afghan wars, kind of set their war default meter to zero. Now it certainly shouldn't be at 10, and there are people who keep theirs at 10. It shouldn't be at zero either. And in fact, I think that the key we have to realize is that every situation is different, has to be thought about carefully. People are right that war is dangerous, even I wrote even during the Iraq War. You didn't prepare for it. You didn't understand, what going to war will do and how it changes your political future and holds you hostage to a million other decisions. Didn't necessarily prepare the country for it very well. It also creates a kind of paranoid mentality. This idea that George W. Bush wanted a war for Iraq, in Iraq, wanted the war. Some say, well, because Saddam had threatened his father or some other reason, wanted the war. Israel wanted the war. Israel would have been much happier, by the way, with a war with Iran, I suspect. And certainly the Israelis didn't believe this idea that if we got rid of Saddam Hussein, there'd be a friendly pro-Israel democracy in Iraq, which is what some of the neocons were promoting at the time. You have to take the look at these things very, very carefully. Have to understand, have to put the context of your own life and your own experience in the context of longer sweep of history. And this is hard because we're all powerfully impacted by the events that are taking place around us as we kind of enter political consciousness and think through it. And clearly, there are important things to be learned from American mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the broader Middle East. But at the same time, the Iraq War, and this is in a sense one of the costs, is that for so many people, the Iraq War is simply the great disaster, the great mistake. I'm not saying it wasn't a disaster, and I'm not saying it wasn't a mistake, but that they don't actually, again, they're sort of incapable sometimes of seeing how it changed things and the consequences that war has for the choices that we have now. One example for me or one very important point is Saddam Hussein was kind of the last great quasi-secular Sunni Arab nationalist, pan-Arabs, who wanted to create a kind of who saw the Arab world as a unitary Sunni thing. And he wanted to be, the Bismarck of the Arabian world. And he was not the only person who aspired to that. Nasser in the 50s, Gaddafi in his way. And Saddam's dream was, to unify that world under his banner, which would make him a great power, which would include the various Gulf oil states. You may remember he invaded and occupied Kuwait at one point. So conquered Kuwait, actually. And again, I think had we not gone in there, more people might have died ultimately as a result of American abstention than of American action in the Gulf War. And that kind of broke open, ended a period in Arab history of this dream, which I think is, I don't actually think it ever made as much sense as some people thought it did. But today, the fact that so many Sunni Arabs understand that their best hope actually lies with a strategic alliance with Israel, which once the Sunni Arabs stop trying to be a single pan-Arab great power, which would crush out any difference or dissidence in its own domains, Israel becomes a logical partner for the Arab world. This is whatever else it is to gain an American foreign policy, a gain for the American national interest. It makes things easier for us that would have been difficult otherwise. Now, I don't know that was on Dick Cheney's mind as he was sort of pushing for a war in Iraq, but it is what happened, and our need to understand that is terrific. And I'm afraid some people are the fog of war has gotten into some minds. And in the same way, while many critics of the war justly said one problem of taking Saddam Hussein out of the equation is that you end up strengthening Iran by removing a powerful rival and check on Iran. That is true, and that's a valid criticism. At the time, the proponents of the Iraq War thought that, oh, well, we'll just set up a beautiful democratic system in Iraq. and then there will be a powerful Iraq, and so we're not going to worry about that anymore. But that is not how things played out, and I think realistically, that's something people should have been able to see. A knowledge of Iraqi history, I think, had I known more about it, I certainly would have been a lot more cautious than I was. But nevertheless, having done that, you now have a super empowered Iran, which has successfully pushed the US to the margins, I think, in Iran, even as it's advanced in Syria, Yemen, and the Houthi and Lebanon. And so the need to counter Iran has grown more acute as a result of the Iraq war. And that, while that is not an advantage or a victory of the Iraq war, it is a consequence of the Iraq war. And we need to think about that and act on it. And I don't think we are. And I think that the consequences are increasingly expensive and dangerous. The final thing is that jihadi ideology, which suffered a severe check in, whatever else you can say, by the end of the Bush administration, the jihadis were militarily weaker and psychologically on the defensive in a way they hadn't been. And the myth of jihadi irresistible victory had been broken. A whole generation in the Arab and Islamic world was looking at the jihadis as losers. We've gradually lost that sense. And you will have people, and I think President Obama in ISIS, to give him credit, the defeat of ISIS was another nail in the coffin of jihadi ideology. This is supposed to be a movement of victory, and here you are getting defeated. But unfortunately, again, we're allowing the jihadis to get their moxie back, to claim wins in Africa. Hamas, while I think its days of trying to claim something as a victory are coming to an end, Hamas certainly had its moment. The Iranians, while they are not Sunni, nevertheless, they're sort of demonstrating to the minds of many Muslims that Muslims who are militant enough and determined enough can push back the non-Islamic world. So we're seeing the jihadis beginning to creep back. I think the failure so far of the Sisi government to find economic stability, progress for Egypt is creating, I think, a vacuum there that is likely to be filled by things we don't like. It's not all the Sisi government's fault by any means. The collapse of tourism in Sinai and the closure of the Suez Canal, or the restriction of commerce in the Red Sea and Suez Canal, are not Sisi's fault in any way, but they affect the situation in Egypt. What we see in rising militants in much of Europe, in the United States, these are not signs that things are going in the right direction. So, talked a long time about this, but it's a big conversation. And I think we have to say that almost a quarter century after 9/11, we are still struggling to cope with the forces that it has unleashed. It's not over yet.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request, Walter, this one from Joni in Oxford, who wants to know, quote, what is the single best book on the French Revolution?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. Thomas Carlyle, French Revolution. That is absolutely, hands down, not just the best book on the French Revolution, but possibly the best book on modern politics. It is an extraordinary work. Now, in some ways, obviously, this book, which I think, got its definitive edition in something like 1837, much of it has been superseded by scholarship, and the point of view is going to be different. It's a hard book to read, I think, especially maybe for younger people whose minds weren't formed by the King James Bible and Shakespeare, because Carlyle shamelessly steals his prose style from these older models. But what he tried to do there, and it's very relevant to us now, he talked about, he used the tools of classical epic poetry to describe what was then still almost contemporary history in the early 19th century. And so you have a struggle between, he would talk about the sort of Olympian gods with their nice palaces and so on, talking about the aristocrats, the nobles, even the technocrats of Versailles and the French government, and then the titanic forces bursting out of the underworld of the suppressed popular feeling, and was also, I think, just really insightful about the way that politics is fundamentally about emotion and feeling much more than about reason. Also, absolutely emphasizes the importance of leadership, or in the case of the French at the time, the absence of so much leadership. And I think if you really get into that book and give it the time it deserves, you will come out with a much deeper understanding, not only of the French Revolution, but of humanity and of the politics of our time.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.